Hey guys, welcome to this module on CSS Flexbox. We're going to learn all about it, how it works, and how we can use it to create complex, flexible layouts using this CSS tool. As we mentioned, a lot of the web layout was originally inspired by newspapers and magazine articles, which is where all these display inline, display block, float all comes from. And over the years, the layout of the web has become more and more complex to the extent where it's no longer really that similar to a magazine. And a website has become far more complex and far more interactive. Over the years, there have been many ways of implementing HTML and CSS to lay out a website. One of the earliest ways was actually using HTML. We had these things called tables. So you could create a table element with table rows and table data to create something like this, a 3-column layout for your website. And if you set the width of these 3 columns to different amounts, then you can lay out your web page like this with 3 boxes or cards or whatever you like to call it. The table element is still very much in use in modern web design, but because it's in the HTML, it should really only be used when semantically you're actually trying to create a table. So in this case, if you were using this to represent some data, like, I don't know, how many car tires were sold on your website or how many visitors you had in May, then that is probably tabular data and should be represented with a table element. But if you're using table just to lay out the styling of your website, then this is very much a no-no in modern web design. And as you'll see, there are much better tools to do this nowadays, so you're not left in the dark. After people stopped using tables for layout, they started using what we've explored previously, which is using the display property. For example, you could set 3 divs to have inline block so that they'll all show up on the same line. And then if you set them to have a specific amount of width, then as long as there is enough for the entire horizontal, they will be stacked up next to each other like this in different columns. There are some problems with this though, because as you can see, the layout doesn't look great, right? Like, why are they not all on one line at the top? And in order to control this and move these blocks up and to have them all lined up, it's actually really fiddly and it's quite a painful process. And people have undergone this process just in order to have a specific styling that they want. You could, for example, use position absolute. So you could take these blocks out of the normal flow of HTML and instead have them be floating above the other content using absolute. And then with absolute, you can of course set the how much you want it to go from the left. And then this way you can set up a relatively complex layout, but it's a very inflexible layout because as soon as anything else gets added to this that's not absolute, say at the bottom, then you're going to have to fiddle around with it to get the right layout, and it's really not responsive and it's just not a great idea. But you know, if you have no other tools, then a hammer is going to do everything, right? But we do have other tools, and one of the most relied on tools in the sort of 2005 to 2010 era was using Float. And as we saw, Float is a very useful tool for floating images to get text to wrap around it. But people realize that you can actually use Float to create more complex layouts as well. For example, we could make all 3 of these float left so that they stack up next to each other. Alternatively, we could make something on the right float to the right, and we could have something float to the left. And as you saw before, we could clear a footer and use float and clear to basically create a more complex layout. And there are so many float related tips and hacks. For example, there's something called the clear fix hack, and there's different hacks to use float and clear to create complex layouts that you would want. But again, you know, it's kind of hacky and it's not that simple to reason about, especially when something goes wrong or something doesn't look quite right. It's really hard to fix. And I saw this a great thing on CSS Puns, which you can Google for, where they had this Titanic float none. That kind of describes how float is considered these days for complex layout. Don't use float for that. Float is great when you want to float an image to the left or the right of a block of text to wrap the text around it, but don't use floats for layout. Instead, use something else like what we're going to explore: Flexbox, Grid, Bootstrap, something that is designed specifically for creating an overall page structure. And within each of these blocks, you could continue to use your float and your clear, but we're keeping to the original intent of that tool. And we're not doing any sort of crazy hacks, because Flexbox is also incredibly easy to use. In order to create that layout that we've been coveting using all these different tricks and different hacks, with Flexbox, all you need to do is to wrap your divs inside a container, and then target that container in your CSS and set the display to flex. That's pretty much it. All you need to do in order to get them to be displayed in columns like this, as you would expect on a modern website. Now, it's also got these great additional properties, like for example, gap, where you can add in a gap between each of these items. And there's a whole lot more that we're going to cover in this module. And you're going to see just how flexible and easy it is to use Flexbox to create more complex layouts on our website. Now, one of the things that you might realize at this stage is this flex is set on the display property. And we know that previously we've looked at display inline, display block, display inline block, and all of that, and display none. This particular set, I want you to think of it as a completely different system. When we're thinking about Flexbox, we have to throw all of this out of the window. That doesn't mean we're not going to use it, because as you see, websites still continue to use these different things. But when you make something flex, it no longer abides by any of these rules. Instead, it's a different system with different rules, and we have to learn about it and think about it as a separate entity. And essentially what happens when we declare something display flex is we give a little bit of the control to Flexbox to lay out our content in a reasonable and commonly desired way. But we have all of these different modifiers in order to tweak it to have the exact layout that we want. Again, just to reiterate, remember previously we mentioned that different elements by default have different display values. A div is by default going to be full width block. A span is by default going to be an inline element. Well, when you use Flexbox and you enclose all of the elements that you want to display inside a flexible container, then what happens is all of these previous display values will be ignored. And instead, we're going to have everything laid out by Flexbox. And the width of each of the elements inside the Flexbox will normally be based on the content size. So it's going to try and let you have all of your content displayed in one line. And it doesn't matter what type of element you've got inside the Flexbox. It's going to apply the Flexbox rules to each of them. As we saw, we could use that property called gap in order to add a gap. So you could, for example, set it to be 10 pixels, which would be pretty static. Or if you want it to be more responsive, you could set it to 1 REM, which, remember from previous lessons we learned is a unit that is going to adapt based on the top level size of your content. By default, when you declare a container to be display flex, it's going to create a container that is going to be actually more or less like a block element. It's going to be 100% full width. But there's also this thing where instead of setting the container to be display flex, you can actually set it to be display inline flex. And similarly to the inline block, What it does is it allows this Flexbox to occupy as much space as it needs, but it means that other things can also go and occupy that same line. So this is just two different versions of creating a Flexbox container. So in this lesson, we looked very briefly at what happens when you set a container to be display flex. So now we're going to try an exercise and see if we've taken on some of the ideas that we've learned in this lesson. Go ahead and download the starting folder and extract it and open it inside VS Code. Select index.html and go ahead and show it in preview mode. You can see I've got a couple of different page layout methods that I mentioned in the lesson, and it's linked to in this home page. So I showed you how an HTML table would look like, and you can look at the code for that layout by going over to htmltable.html. You can see we've set different values on the table data or the actual table itself and the different table rows, and we've created a reasonable sort of layout. And then you can see how we can create a similar layout using inline block, and how this is also more or less responsive. We've set different widths, but you can see how the layout is actually all defaulting down to squish at the bottom. And I want you just to explore some of these different ways of laying out content on a web page. Now, finally, I want you to take a look at flex.html and see how easy it was to create that layout and how few lines of code it actually required. Now, once you've done that, it's time for your challenge, which is to take the index.html page, which looks like this, and it's created using a whole bunch of list items. Now, I've gotten rid of the bullet points by setting list style to none, which you can switch on and off to see what happens. And this basically just gets rid of the bullet points, but I want you to turn this into a navigation bar. So I want everything to be on the horizontal. And if you take a look inside the goal image, this is what you're looking for. So you want all of these things to go up so that they are kind of laid out like this. You want to have a gap between them. You can set how big this gap you want to be. But essentially, this is the sort of outcome you're looking for. And I want you to do it using Flexbox. Pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so this should be a relatively simple challenge. So we've got our preview on the right, and then we've got our index on the left. If you remember, Flexbox is declared on the container that contains all the elements that you want to flex. So in this case, we've got a div with a class of container that contains all the things we want. Let's go into this class selector and then go ahead and change the display to flex. And you can see almost immediately everything is now on the same line, looking pretty much like a nav bar that you would see out in the wild. The only thing we need to do is add a little bit of a gap between each of those items. So we could either add a 10 pixel gap, which looks pretty good, or you could use the rem system. If you don't remember what the rem is about, go back. There is a lesson where we covered font sizes where we talk about this in more detail. But no matter which way you do, you should be able to achieve this layout relatively easily. And if you want to take a look at the solution, you can see as well that the only thing that's really added are these two things in order to achieve this final goal outcome. Hopefully you managed to do that and you managed to see what declaring display as flex does to our HTML elements. And in the next lesson, we're going to dive deeper into Flexbox, and we're going to learn more about the Flexbox axes and the direction of flex. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Hey guys, so in the last lesson, we saw how Flexbox can be declared on a container and how it can start already doing its thing based on the automatic default values. But in this lesson, I want to talk to you about something called flex direction so that we can actually learn how to modify our Flexbox in order to achieve the layouts that we want. When we think about a HTML default flow, normally items get laid out like this. So if they're inline, they'll continue stacking inline until there is no more space. If they are block, they will stack one on top of each other and they will continue like this. And this is the sort of default HTML flow. It goes from top to bottom. As you saw previously with our Flexbox, as soon as we put everything inside a flexible container, all of the items that are contained gets put onto this row. It gets lined up all along like this, and they go one after the other from left to right. And the reason for this is because there is a property in Flexbox called the flex direction. And by default, this flex direction is set to row. So it means that things will be laid out along a row. And it's a little bit confusing because you might think, well, actually, I'm creating columns here, right? But I want you to think about it in terms of how the next item is going to be stacked onto the page. And it's going to be stacked on one after the other onto the same row until there is no more space, and it's still going to try and continue to stack it from left to right. In Flexbox, that means when you have a flex direction set to row, then you're setting something called the main axis. In this case, this is the main axis. It's going from left to right and is on the horizontal. When flex direction is row, main axis is horizontal from left to right. And then there's something called the cross axis. The cross axis goes perpendicular to the main axis. That means in the case where flex direction is row, the cross axis goes from top to bottom. Bear with me here, I'm going to show you the other option. If we didn't set the flex direction, it would default to row, but if we had set the flex direction to column, then what it's going to do is it's going to make all of the items inside this flexible container go from top to bottom. So now what we've done is we've changed the main axis. The main axis is now from top to bottom. And that means that the cross axis is the one that's now from left to right. Now, why does all of these main axis and cross axis even matter? Well, it matters when we want to continue to customize our Flexbox items. Let's take an example property, for example, the flex basis. Now, you can imagine this property almost like setting the height in this case. If we go ahead and increase this height to 100 pixels, then what's going to happen is it will expand along the main axis to satisfy that requirement of the flex basis 100 pixel. Now, this is the thing about the flex basis. If instead of having the main axis along this way, if the main axis was this way, so in the case of flex direction set to row, then remember the main axis is now this way. And so now when we set the flex basis to a larger flex basis, instead of setting the height as we did previously, it's now actually setting the width. When this happens, we're again going to use flex basis 100. And when the code runs, it changes the width of each of the items inside the container to satisfy that requirement. As you can see, along with flex basis and a number of other properties, essentially they are flexing along the main axis. When it's a row, the flex basis is the width, and when it's a column, the flex basis is a height. Essentially, we are flexing along the main axis. That's why the main axis and the cross axis matters when it comes to flex direction. Let's go ahead and try an exercise to see if you can apply a different flex direction to the code that we've set up for you. So go ahead and extract the flex direction folder and open up index.html, and then go ahead and show it inside preview. Now you'll see I've created all the colors of a rainbow inside a container. Now in this case, we've already set it to display flex, and remember by default, the flex direction will be a row. So it's flexing along this direction, left to right, as the main axis. Now the goal, or what it is that you're trying to solve, is to change the layout so that not only are they taller, but also they are aligned along this top to bottom axis. And I can tell you that this height of each item is 100 pixels high. You're going to have to learn to use the flex direction, also what we learned about the flex basis, in order to get this outcome. Now, there is one thing that you might need to be able to achieve this. Because remember, the flex basis is set on the child element. So each of these elements, and not on the container, like with display flex or with gap, they're all going onto the container or the parent. But the flex basis has to actually go onto the child. So I want you to take a look at the developer docs that I've linked to see which selector you need to use and how to combine the selectors in order to target all of these divs. Now, because all of these divs don't really share anything in common, for example, they don't have the same class, or they're not a different type of element, I don't want you to change any of the HTML. I want you to use CSS to target just these divs. And we've learned about some of this before when we learned about combining selectors. So if you want to do a quick recap of that lesson, this might be a good moment. Alternatively, you can do what every developer does when they forget how to do something, which is take a look at the documentation. This is a sort of a two-part challenge, but essentially the end outcome is to achieve something that looks like this without changing any of the HTML. Pause the video, have a read through the docs, see if you can figure this out. All right, so let's go ahead and try to solve this. The first thing we know we need to do in order to turn it from this left to right and instead go from top to bottom is we need to change the flex direction. So as I mentioned, the flex direction is a property that goes onto the parent, and we can change it to column so that instead of lining up like this, it lines up from top to bottom. Now, unfortunately, you can see by default, everything is occupying 100% of the width, and we don't really want that. We want it to only occupy as much width as we have content for. This is a little bit of a challenge, but this is something that we mentioned in the last lesson. Instead of having display as flex, where the entire container is going to occupy the full width, we can change it to inline flex, which is going to make it occupy only as much width as it needs to fit the widest bit of content contained in the container. That was a little bit of a revision for you there, trying to catch you out to see if you remember what we learned in the last lesson. The next thing we have to do in order to achieve this goal is to try and make it a little bit taller. And I mentioned that we can do that by using the flex basis property. But I also mentioned that you can't set the flex basis on the container. See what happens if I try to do this. Flex basis on the parent container, let's set it to 100 pixels, and then once it reloads, pretty much nothing happens. This is not a property that's intended for the parent. And remember, when it comes to Flexbox, the container that contains the elements, this is the parent. And each of these items in here, these are the children, or normally we just call them items. How do we target all of the items inside this div? We've got a div called container and we want to get all of its children. Well, if we take a look at this hint, then you can see that we once upon a time learned about combinators, different ways of combining CSS selectors. There's the descendant combinator. There's also something called the child combinator. that is done using this lesser than sign between two selectors, and it matches only the elements where the second selector are the direct children that's matched by the first. This basically says if we have a selector that selects the parent and then we have a selector for the child, then we're only going to select the direct children. And in this case, that's pretty much exactly what we want to do. Now, I also linked to this other MDN doc, which is about the universal selector. So remember, using the asterisk, we can select all the elements. If in this case, what we're trying to select is to select all the elements that are the direct children of the dot container class. The dot container class is our Flexbox container, and in order to get hold of all the children, using what we just read from the MDN docs, we can select that container using that right angle bracket as the combinator, and then the children selector that we're going to use is simply an asterisk. And this is going to select all of the direct children, so not the grandchildren or, 2 levels down, 3 levels down. So if we had a div inside this div, because this is not a direct child, this is actually a grandchild, then it's not going to be selected by this combination. All the direct children of the dot container class is all of our flexible items. And then we're going to change the flex basis to 100 pixels. And because our main axis is from top to bottom, because we've set the flex direction to column, then our flex basis, 100 pixels, will get applied to each of these child items, and we're able to achieve the final goal outcome. So there were quite a few bits in this challenge, but hopefully you got there in the end, maybe with a few hints from me. But I want you to play around with this flex direction, see what happens when you change it, see what happens when you change, say, the flex basis and you change the flex direction. See what happens when you change the display inline flex to something else. See what happens when you have a flex basis on, but there's not enough widths, and all of these things. For now, don't worry too much about how sizing is handled in Flexbox, because it is one of the weirdest parts of Flexbox, and there's going to be a lesson that I'm going to dedicate to Flexbox sizing. But for now, you can see how lovely our Flexbox flexes along the different axes and how useful this is for creating different layouts. And once you're done playing around with flex direction, head over to the next lesson and we're going to learn more about the different properties that we can apply to the parent Flexbox container. For all of that and more, I'll see you there. Now that we've seen that we can create a Flexbox, we can set the flex direction. In this lesson, I want to dive deeper into probably the biggest topic of Flexbox, which is creating layout and how you create flexible layout. What is the automatic or default behavior of Flexbox, and what can you change to make it what you want it to be? One of the first things to differentiate when we're talking about the different properties to set is this property going to go onto the child, which is the flex item? So in this case, each of these items that are contained within the flexible container is a child, or is the property going onto the parent, so the container? And it's important when you're learning Flexbox to really differentiate between these two things, because as we saw earlier, if you set a property that's intended for the child on the parent selector, it's not going to work. So the first thing I want to mention is that, and this property is called order. As you can imagine, what it sets is the order of your child items. Normally, this is the color of the rainbow, and you might remember the acronym ROY, G, BIV, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Now, funnily enough, when I learnt the rainbow, for some reason in my mind, blue and indigo were always the other way around. What if you wanted to rearrange these colors of the rainbow? Well, you would use the order property. By default, everything has an order of 0. So they're arranged by their order in the HTML. The red div is above the orange div, and this is where the order comes from. What if you wanted to change that? Well, you could set the order. For example, if I selected the green div and I said, well, let's set its order property to 1. Well, immediately it's going to go right to the end of the Flexbox. It's going to be the one at the end. Now, you could change that to 1, or you could have it as 5 or 10 or 20, whatever it is. As long as there's nothing set between that number and any of these other ones, which are all defaulting to 0, then it's just going to look at which one's bigger, right? 10 is bigger than 0, so 10 is going to go here. But if this was 9, then obviously 10 is greater than 9, 9 is greater than 0. But say this was, I don't know, 20, then the 20 is going to get moved over here. So this is just a really easy way of picking out a specific element that is a Flexbox item and then setting the order property on it to be whichever it is you want to be to set up the order. So pretty simple so far. The next one I want to mention is something called the Flex Wrap property. And this is really useful when you run out of space on the horizontal. Here we've got a row-based Flexbox. The main axis is from left to right. New items gets added on here at the right. But what happens if you have too many items, or some of these items are a bit longer? Well, it's just going to be pushed to the end, and once we run out of space, it's not going to go on to the next line. This is the default behavior of Flexbox, and the Flex Wrap property is normally set to no wrap. Don't ask me why there is no hyphen between no and wrap, like a good CSS value should be, but this is just how it is. And every single time I look at that property, I always see the words now wrap, and I think about Snoop Dogg rapping to my Flexbox. But remember, no hyphen, that's just the default behavior. Let's say we have a new item and everything is set to no wrap, then it's just going to continue pushing until you can't collapse any of these items anymore and things get pushed off the page. Now you can change this property to wrap instead, but this is not a very responsive layout because when you shrink the width of your window, then all the items that don't fit are going to be pushed off the screen and the user won't be able to see it. If you want this to actually continue on to the next line instead of being invisible, then you could change this property, Flex Wrap, to wrap instead. And what this will do is it'll move all the elements that don't have enough space to fit in its full minimum width onto the top line. It'll just go to the next line and continue wrapping. Now remember, this Flex Wrap is a property on the parent. So this is set onto the Flexbox container itself. And it tells how all of the children should behave, namely they should wrap around. Now, it's a really good idea to play around with some of these properties to see how they work, which is why I've created a demo website for you at appbrew.github.io/flex-layout. So if you go to this website, you'll see we've got our rainbow colors and we've got some selectors down here. We just learned about Flex Wrap, which can be changed on the container. And the container is this orange box that you see around the entire border here. If we turned this container into, say, Flex Wrap, then you can see what will happen is when I decrease the width of the screen, all of those child flex items go onto the next line, which is pretty neat. Now, there's also something called wrap reverse, and it means that things are wrapped, but it goes from the bottom right corner to the top left corner instead of the normal version, which is from the top left to the bottom right. It's sort of like an axis, I guess, because we're now in 2 dimensions when we're wrapping. Have a play around with that, and then once you're done, let's learn about another property. This one is called justify content, and again, it's set on the parent container. Justify content basically sets the distribution of our items along the main axis. This concept of main axis and cross axis is going to come back, but remember what we learned when we learned about the flex direction. When we have a row, the main axis is from left to right, and the cross axis is from top to bottom. So here we have a row-based flexbox, so that's how it's set up. And if it was a column-based setup, then the main and the cross axis would flip. In this particular example, if we set the justify content to flex start, then this is exactly what you're going to see. Everything is going to be bunched up to the left. And on the opposite end of that is flex end, where everything gets bunched up all to the end. And this is, of course, provided that when all the items are expanded to their maximum width, there is still space left for us to actually justify the content. If all the items have already taken up all this space, then this is not going to behave like this. Now, the next one is justify content center, which is a pretty easy way of centering items in CSS compared to all of the other ways that we can center using traditional CSS. This is a really almost like a godsend of a property. Very easy to horizontally center, or if you had the main axis going that way, you could vertically center as well. And then there's also different properties which allow you to have spacing between the different elements. And this is something that's used really commonly because when you're creating a website layout, you kind of want everything to use up the available space and create some gaps between each other to distribute. Coming back to our demo website on Flex Layout, then if we take a look at the justify content, you can see we've got flex start, flex end, and I want you to just play around with some of these different versions. So space between makes sure that the first and last items are stuck to the edges of the container, and then space around makes sure that this gap between the left and the right, the center, add up to the space between each of the items, and then there's space evenly where each of the gaps are equal. So Flexbox does all of the maths and calculations for us in order to achieve the layout that we want. And if you play around with some of these different versions, then you can see what is it that you want to achieve and which value you'll need to set for justify content. The next property is called align items. And align items is a little bit different from justify items, even though some of the values might seem really similar. This is the position of the item. So remember, this is a row-based flexbox. So here is our main axis, and this is what we use justify content to set the distribution. Now, in this case, we've got align items, which actually sets the distribution along the cross axis. And again, this is a property that's set on our container. But if you notice here, our container is only taking up the height of our items. For align items to really work, we actually need to set the height of the container. So in this case, we're setting it to 70 VH, and VH is short for viewport height. It's basically the height of the window that you're viewing the page. If this was the window size, then this would be 100 VH, And then if we're setting it to, this is not quite 70, this is more like maybe 60, but this height is what we're setting when we set the height of our container. So once our container is a little bit bigger, then we actually have the ability to align our items. Align items flex start is going to make it all bunch up to the top. And then we've got flex end, which makes everything bunch up to the bottom. And similarly to justify content, we've got center, and we've also got some other stuff. To demonstrate align items, I want you to change the flex wrap back to no wrap if you've changed this. And then if you see flex start, flex end, center, baseline, or stretch, they all work pretty much as you would expect. Now, if wrap was enabled, then you're going to see that the behavior is not going to be quite what you expect. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about align content. But for now, keep the wrap set to no wrap and then play around with align items. Now, what if you wanted to align everything in the container to the center? So you use align items center, but then you wanted one particular item, for example, this one, to be right at the top. Well, it would need a different align value, right? In this case, what you can do is all of these properties that we've set over here are on the container, so on the parent. But you can reach into the actual item itself and set a property called align self. So this is saying, let's be an independent item and let's think for ourselves. If we set this property to start or end or whichever it is that you want, then it'll actually make this item separate from the groupthink and do its own thing. At this point, you might already be a little bit overwhelmed by all of the different options. You're thinking, oh, what if I don't remember all of these? Do I have to memorize everything? No, we are programmers. We don't memorize anything because we have the internet and the computer at our fingertips. A good resource I want to point you to is the CSS Flexbox cheat sheet from CSS Tricks. And I will link to it in the course resources for this lesson. So you can either download the entire poster or you can just look through it in the web page. Notice how they differentiate between properties for the parent and the properties for the children. When we look at something that we've talked about just now, for example, flex wrap, it tells you all the different possible options. So you wouldn't set all three, you would pick one. And it tells you what each of these values will do. Similarly, we've got our justify content. It shows you what each of them does and also describes what each of them does. And then align items. And then what we saw just now was a property for the children, which is the align self property. And you can see all of the different possible variations that you could use. Now, the final property I want to talk about today is the align content. And I said I would come back to this. Align content is similar to align items, but it only works when you have the flex wrap set to wrap. So when you've made your items wrap, and then you want to specify how the content should align, then that's when you would set align content. If we applied align content to center and we made our flexbox wrap, then when the width of our window reduces, everything will bunch up together. If they need a second line, they'll go on to the second line, and then it's going to look at this align content value to see how it should be spaced on the screen. One of the things you might be wondering at this stage, well, what exactly is the difference between align items and align content? Because when everything is no wrap, when we set align content, it doesn't really do anything. But when we set our items to wrap and then there's not enough width to have everything on one line, that's when our align content starts working. So we can set it to center, we can set it to flex end, to flex start. have a play around with the different properties and take a look at the cheat sheet here. Remember, you don't need to memorize anything as long as you know where to go and find help. So when you want to align something and you don't remember what justify content does, go over here, just read the different values and pick the one that you want. And I'm really big believer in the sort of just-in-time recap. So when you're learning stuff like you are now, I'm trying to tell you all the things that are possible. And then when you actually need to apply it for your own projects, you remember the fact that this is possible. And all you need to do is just to refresh yourself on how to do it precisely. And that way you don't have to memorize any of the things. Now, in order to complete this lesson, I want you to complete the Flexbox Froggy game. This is an interactive game, and it's a really, really brilliant concept created by Thomas Park, where you can apply your knowledge of everything that you've learned just now in order to move the frog to the lily pad. Head over to appri.github.io/flexboxfroggy, and I want you to go into the settings, and I want you to go ahead and select intermediate. Now, notice here there are also different languages if you need that. You can also change the colorblind mode to on or off, but I want you to complete the challenges in intermediate mode. So there's no directions, but remember you have the cheat sheet and you have what you've learned in this lesson. And the goal is to write the code that's going to move our frog onto the lily pad. So for example, in this case, we've got display flex. So we know that this is a default row-based Flexbox. If I want to move my frog from the start to the end, all I have to do is use justify content and set it to flex-end. And once I've done that, you can see my frog is on the lily pad and the next button becomes active. That's just a demo. The rest you're going to have to figure out yourself. If you get stuck, you can go back to the beginner difficulty where they're going to give you a lot more hints. But ideally, I want you to stay on intermediate with no directions. Do as a professional developer would to read the either MDN docs, or in this case, probably easier to just go to the cheat sheet and figure out what will help you. And maybe even use the demo page to help you figure out what it is you need in order to move your frogs. Go ahead and try and complete all of the different levels. And if you get stuck, you can always change the difficulty and you will probably be able to solve everything much more easily. Pause the video and give that a go now. And once you're done, head over to the next lesson where we're going to continue learning about how sizing works in Flexbox. Hey guys, so in the last lesson, we looked at the various Flexbox properties that determine the layout of our items in a Flexbox container. We looked at the things that we can change about the Flex items and the things that we can change about the Flex container. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to size the items in a Flexbox container, shrinking and growing, and how it should behave when it's in a responsive situation. Let's say we had a web page with 4 paragraph elements. So we know that paragraph elements are going to be full width because they are all block elements and they have a default amount of sort of margin and also padding. If we go ahead and put all of those paragraph elements into a Flexbox container, even if that container is invisible, it's going to turn each of these paragraph elements into Flex items. And by default, as you might remember, the main axis is along a row, and we can of course change that, but it stacks each of these items based on the size of their content, one next to each other without any gaps between. At this stage, even without writing any sizing properties, this has a default behavior where if we go ahead and change the width of our window or our viewport, if this is shrunken, then you'll see these blocks shrink in response. And Flexbox does most of this automatically. having a behavior that in most cases is what we would want, but sometimes you're going to need to customize this. And to be able to customize how each of the items inside a Flexbox is sized, we're going to need to learn a little bit about how it actually gets worked out and what is the algorithm essentially that Flexbox uses to determine each of the Flex items' size. And the way that it works it out is basically a priority list. The first thing it looks at is whether if there is a minimum width and a maximum width that's set on the item. If this is not set, then it's going to look at the next thing, which is there a flex basis set? And previously we looked at this property, flex basis, as a way to set the width on a row-based Flexbox or the height on a column-based Flexbox. Essentially, whichever direction is the main axis, the size is going to follow that axis. If there's no flex basis set either, it's going to look at the width, or in the case of a column-based Flexbox, it's going to look at the height property. And we've already previously set the height property and the width property, and you can set that on any HTML element, so there's nothing new there. Now the final one that looks at if none of those are set is the actual content width. Let's say you had a item that contained a paragraph with the word app brewery. The content width, the ideal width, is basically the width that allows that text to be lined up next to each other. If the flexible box had to shrink, then it will go down to the minimum size, which is where the text wraps and they are stacked one on top of each other. This is now pretty much the minimum content width. So I'm going to show you an example of all 4 ways of setting the sizing, and we'll see with real examples of how this actually works in code format. Let's first create a flex container that is just set to display flex, has a gap of 10 pixels. Inside this flex container, I've got 4 items, and each of those are paragraph items, similar to what we saw before. Each of these paragraph items obviously contain text that have different lengths. If we go ahead and just by default put these items inside a flex container, such as here, then when we go ahead and shrink the size of this window, then what's going to happen is each of these items are going to automatically shrink until they reach the minimum content size. Notice that this box is the largest, and that's because the longest word in that entire line of text is this word, programming. So that determines the minimum width of this box because it doesn't want to put words onto different lines. So it's going to set this as the minimum width that it will shrink down to. When this is sort of in real life, let's go ahead and animate it. This is what you'll actually see. It's going to shrink and shrink and shrink until it's reached that minimum width for the content. And then you'll see afterwards, all of that content gets pushed off the page and it will not be visible on screen anymore. This is the default behavior of Flexbox without us setting any of the sizing properties. And as I mentioned, by default, the max width looks at the longest possible line of the text, and the minimum width looks at the longest word to determine the minimum width. Now let's take a look at what happens if we decide to set manually the width of each of the items. Notice here that the flex container still has the same code as before. It has a gap of 10 pixels. It's set to display flex. But now for each of these green items, we've now targeted them inside our CSS, and we've decided that we want each of them to have a width of 100 pixels. And that's exactly what you see here. Each of these have the same size and they are all 100 pixels wide. So now when the container gets shrunk, what happens is it's going to try and respect that width until there is not enough overall width of the container. So if we had 4 items which are 100 pixels each, then this container has to be 400 pixels, right? If this width becomes less than 400 pixels, then it's going to continue using the same algorithm to shrink each of the items. Now, again, notice that the shrinking is not uniform. It's still trying to conform to that minimum size of the content. So that even though the text goes onto different lines, the longest word is still kept intact. When there is enough space, it's going to respect this width, but as soon as there's not enough space in the container to accommodate all of the items that have the set width, it's going to ignore this and dynamically shrink each of the items until it reaches that minimum width for each item. Whereas initially, if we had nothing set on the items, it's going to look at the length of the entire line when it's all on one line. So that is going to be the content width. If, however, you have a width property set, then it's going to look at that instead of the content width. So instead of everything being all on one line, it's going to look at, well, what is the width that you've set? So if we said it's going to be 100 pixels, then it's going to try and make it 100 pixels wide until you have shrunken the container where it can no longer fit everything as 100 pixels. Then it starts shrinking the box. Now, the next thing that we can try adding is the flex basis. Notice how I've got a width set, but I've also got a flex basis set. And because I've got a row-based flex container, because I haven't changed it to column, remember we said the flex basis is effectively determining the width of each of the items. What does this look like then? Well, when you actually run this code, you're going to see that it's going to completely ignore this width because you have a flex basis set. And it's going to set each of the items to that flex basis, which in this case is 200 pixels. And you can see it's a little bit wider than the previous example. However, this again is in the situation where the container has plenty of space to fill. Even though you've got 200 pixels for each item, there's still space left. But if you shrink everything down where there's no more space and there's not enough space to give each item 200 pixels, then exactly the same thing happens. It's going to look at that minimum width again. And it works pretty much the same as it did with width. When we animate this, you'll see that it will give it 200 pixels if it can, and if it can't, then it's going to shrink it to the minimum width. So remember that when we have a flex basis, it will completely ignore the width. So there's actually not even any point in setting it because it's going to be looking at the more important property, which is the flex basis in this case. We've seen how we've gone from the content width, which is the default, to a set width, to a flex basis. And now we're going to see what happens with the minimum width and the maximum width. As I mentioned, there is a default max width and min width that's set based on the content. So the maximum width is all of the content lined up, occupying the ideal state, which in the form of text is to have everything on one line. And the minimum width is determined by the longest word, and it's going to be the width of that word at the font size that's set. You can also manually set each of these properties and completely ignore the content. And in some cases, that might be useful. Let's say that we had a flex basis of 200 pixels set on each of these items, but we go ahead and also set a maximum width of 100 pixels. Notice that in this case, 100 pixels is less than 200 pixels. So the flex basis is actually larger than the maximum width. So what happens? Well, instead of respecting the flex basis, which is 200 pixels, even when there's plenty of space, it's going to look at that max width and it's only going to give each item 100 pixels. So this max width determines how much the maximum width that the item is allowed to grow to. even if you give it all the space in the world, how wide can it possibly be? Well, it's going to look at the max width. And if that max width is smaller than the flex basis, then it's going to take this value. But if the flex basis was smaller than the max width, for example, if we had a flex basis, instead of 200, it was, 50 pixels. Well, then in that case, each of these items will actually be 50 pixels instead. The maximum width is the maximum possible. It's going to try and respect the flex basis unless the max width happens to be smaller. And if we take a look at this in animation, you'll see that as I shrink this container, each of the items shrink. And as I grow the container, each of the items grow in size, but only up until that maximum width. The max width determines the growth potential of each of the items. On the other hand, there is the minimum width. As I said, the maximum width determines how big each of the items can grow to, and the minimum width determines how small each of the items can shrink to. Now, let's go back to that situation where we have a flex basis of 200 pixels. But in addition, we set the minimum width to 300 pixels. So notice in this case, 300 pixels is bigger than 200 pixels. What's going to happen when our website gets rendered? Well, it's going to look like this. This is 200 pixels, and this is 300 pixels. As you'll notice, it's actually respecting the minimum width, even though we have a flex basis that's set. When the minimum width is larger than the flex basis, it's going to respect that minimum width. But in addition, when we try to shrink our container down, it's only going to shrink until the minimum width is reached. So if your minimum width is very large, then it's not going to shrink beyond this size. So I've talked a little bit about growing and shrinking, and this is a really important concept to understand in Flexbox, because a lot of that flexibility, the flexible part of the flexible box, comes from this ability to grow and to shrink. It's probably easier to understand these properties by switching both of them off first. So we can switch each of these property off by setting it to 0. So let's set flex grow to 0 and flex shrink to 0 and see what happens to our boxes. They start out being 100 pixels wide. And then when we go ahead and try to grow and shrink it, namely trying to increase and decrease the width of the window, you can see that our items don't actually change in their size at all. They just stay exactly the same size as before because it can't grow and it can't shrink. So this doesn't even look like a Flexbox anymore, right? Let's go ahead and switch some of those things on. If we go ahead and change the flex grow to 1, which means that flex grow is on, but flex shrink is off, then what's going to happen is each of these items will first start out at 100 pixels. Remember, the flex basis is the initial starting value. It tries to be 100 pixels wide. But then, because it's allowed to grow and there is plenty of space to grow, there's way more than 400 pixels to fit our 4 items, then it's going to increase the width of each of these items until the entire width of the container is filled up by each of our items. So when we adjust the width of our container, this is where you can see that when the width is reduced, it gets reduced to that flex shrink amount, which is 100 pixels. But it doesn't go any further than that. Any further than that, the items start going off the screen. But when there's more than 100 pixels, for example, when we're widening the amount of space, like here, it will continue to grow until it can fill up all of the space. Now, what if we switch that around? Let's turn off flex grow and turn on flex shrink. What happens here is by default, it is going to set everything to the flex basis, so 100 pixels, and it's not going to grow to fill the space, but it is going to shrink beyond the flex basis size until you reach that minimum width. And because that's not set in this case, then it's just going to look at the minimum width of the content. So this is actually the default setting of Flexbox items. It's going to not grow, but it is going to shrink. Even if you didn't set these two properties, you would see this behavior by default. Now, the next example I've got is where flex grow and flex shrink are both on. And as you can imagine, what's going to happen is it's going to try and take up as much width as possible. And then when you shrink it, it's going to try and be as small as possible. So in this case, the flex basis is pretty much completely ignored because flex grow and flex shrink are both on. It's actually going to grow to the max width, and it's going to shrink to the minimum width. And if these two are not set, then it's going to infer that from the content of those items. Now, the default for flex basis is actually auto. And auto is a little bit of a complex one because it's going to look at the amount of content in each of the items. So it's going to give more flex basis to the items with more content. For example, this last item with the most words. And it's going to give less width to the ones that have smaller content. If you don't want that, and instead you want everything to be equal width, then you simply switch it off by giving it a 0. There's actually a shorthand way of writing this without having to write out flex basis, flex grow, flex shrink. And we've seen this style of shorthand before in CSS. The first value is the grow. The second value is the shrink. And the third value is the basis. So it's exactly the same, but it's obviously a lot quicker to write. And because this particular set is so commonly used, you can actually shorten this even further by simply just writing flex 1. And that means a grow of 1, a shrink of 1, and a basis of 0 to keep everything equal. We've actually seen this before where we created containers with different size ratios. A red item that is half the size of the blue container, which has a flex of 2, and the blue one is 2/3 the size of the one with a flex of 3. And essentially what we're doing here is we're setting the grow to 1 and the shrink to 1. And in this case, it's a grow of 2 and a shrink of 2. In this way, we're able to set a ratio for how our elements will respond responsively. So no matter if you grow or shrink, it's going to try and keep these ratios, and it's going to try and respect that even while it's being responsibly resized. That was quite a lot of information on how Flexbox sizing works. Let's go ahead and try an exercise to see if you can apply this in code and see if you've understood a lot of the principles that we talked about in this lesson. So head over to this URL where I've prepared an exercise for you. You can simply just write your code inside this text box, and then when you click Apply CSS, the goal is that your CSS rules will allow this blue Flexbox to behave the same way as this green one. So I want you to resize the window and see how the green box behaves. Does it grow? Does it shrink? What's the size that it wants to be? And I want you to use what you see on screen. So notice how I've told you what each of these should be in terms of their ideal width. And I want you to write your code down here, whatever it is that you need. Maybe you don't need to write any code under some of the brackets. Maybe you need to write more code. But essentially, once you click Apply CSS, the blue boxes, which you control with your code, should have the same behavior as the green ones. Pause the video now, head over here, and give that exercise a go. All right, so the first thing that you might notice is something that's actually completely unrelated to sizing, which is the fact that each of our items are distributed along this container. And that, if you remember from a previous lesson, so a little bit of revision here, is done using Justify Content. And this particular style of Justify Content is actually space between. So if I click Apply CSS, you can see it's now spaced between. Now, the next thing we need to change is the fact that each of these items actually should have different ideal widths. And we know we can set that by using the flex basis. Let's go ahead and set the flex basis for each of our items based on those widths. So it's 200 pixels for the item 1, 200 pixels for item 2, and 400 pixels for item 3. Let's apply our CSS, and you can see they're now equal width. And it looks like everything's the same. We've achieved our goal. But remember I said you have to resize things, and notice how they don't behave the same at all. Now, when we resize this, you'll notice that item 1 actually shrinks in our green flex box, but item 2 and 3 don't shrink at all. So we can tell that 2 and 3 probably have shrink disabled, and item 1 is left to shrink. Now, by default, I mentioned that all items in a flex box are allowed to shrink, and you can see our blue 1, 2, and 3 all in fact do that, shrink to fit the space. Now, that is probably a more useful behavior in reality, but in this case, because we're trying to do an exercise, let's go ahead and match it. So let's turn the flex shrink off on item 2 by setting it to 0. And let's do the same for item 3. Let's apply our CSS and see it now behaves exactly the same. So that is the solution to this simple exercise. But even though it's simple, it's actually quite difficult to work out exactly what needs to be changed. And hopefully through doing this exercise, you've had to review some content from before, such as Justify Content, and also you've had to think hard about how flex shrink, flex basis, and all of these different things we learned in today's lesson actually works. Have a play around with the code, try writing some stuff yourself, and once you're ready, go ahead to the next lesson where we have our final section project. All right, it's time to put all of our knowledge into action by building a project together. And we're going to use everything we learned about Flexbox to build a pricing table. You've probably seen pricing table out on the internet before. It's usually 3 categories, small, medium, large, and it shows the customers which features they'll get based on which tier they're going to subscribe to. This is pretty much what we're going to build, although a little bit simplified. And the great thing about our version, because we now know about Flexbox, is we can make the width of each of these pricing cards change dynamically based on the width that's available. And we can also make it responsive in the way that when the window goes below a certain size, it actually stacks these vertically rather than having them horizontally. You should have enough knowledge now to be able to complete this project. Go ahead and download the starting files for our pricing table project, extract it, and open it up inside VS Code. Now, once you're here, I want you to go ahead and look inside the index.html and show it in preview. You can see that we've got all of the HTML for you, all of the text and all of the boring parts out of the way. But in the CSS, it's a little bit lacking. The only thing I've done is I've applied a Google font called Sono, and it gives it this fun styling for our font. Now, what you're aiming for is determined by the goal large. So this is what it should look like when it's large in terms of the width of your screen. And when the width of your screen is small, this is what it should look like. Have a think about how you might do this, how you might apply apply the different types of CSS styling. So things like background, or maybe a corner radius, or maybe getting rid of borders around the buttons, or thinking about how you might use Flexbox to achieve this kind of transition from large width to small width, and see how far you can get. Again, remember this is a project, so it's totally up to you. You don't have to style it like this at all. You can style it however you like. But the most important thing is our Flexbox aspect. I want you to make sure that these items are inside a Flexbox so that they adapt to the width and they're responsive on mobile in this case. So when the width is very small, they get stacked up one on top of the other. That is the very simple criteria. Everything else is totally up to you. Now, there's one hint I'm going to add in here, which is a media query. And I want you to think about what can you do using a media query and Flexbox to achieve this type of responsiveness. Pause the video and give this challenge a go. Once you're done, you can come back and I'll run through my solution with you. But remember, your solution is as good as mine as long as you're happy with it. The important thing is to apply the skills that you've learned. So pause the video, give that a go now. All right, I'm going to walk through my version of this pricing table that's in the solution.html, and I'm going to walk through the code one section at a time. The first section is our pricing container, and this basically just applies Flexbox to each of our container items, makes it justified to the center, so that's all grouped towards the center, and gives it a little bit of a gap between each item, and sets the height of the pricing container. And then when we set the justify content to center, align items to center, and the height of this flexible container to full height, so 100 vertical height, then it's going to make everything centered vertically and horizontally. This is a really easy, almost cheats way of centering anything vertically and horizontally. You might know this, you might not, but using just normal HTML, normal CSS without Flexbox or Grid or one of the other frameworks is actually not that simple to set something to the middle of the screen. So this is an incredibly easy way of achieving that. And I hope by this point you understand why it's able to do that. The next thing we're going to do is to set our pricing plan. Our pricing plan corresponds to each of the items in our container. And what I've done is I've set the flex to 1 so that they are equal in width and that they are allowed to grow and shrink. I've set the maximum width to 400, and this is probably a little bit easier to see on the full width screen. So that means that they don't go all the way. And by setting that maximum width, basically I'm saying each of these cards should limit themselves to that 400 pixel size so that they don't take up the full width, and then our centering kind of becomes moot because it's taking up the full width. And I think this just looks a little bit better in my opinion. And that's achieved using the max width. Now I've added a little bit of padding inside each of these boxes just so that they're not right up to the edge on all the sides, and I've added a sort of grey background color to differentiate it from the background. I've given it a border radius of 5 pixels, which just makes these corners a little bit rounded, which I think looks nice, and I've aligned the text to the center. The next 4 sections are pretty much all just for styling. Let's go ahead and talk through each of them. The plan title I've made super large, so I increased the font size, made the font weight bold, and also set a little bit of margin at bottom to move everything away from it so that it's not sticking right next to it. This is all personal preference. It depends on your eye. Whatever you think is right is right. And then I've set the plan price to an even bigger size so that it's really stand out, tells people what it's all about. Set it to bold, also gave it a little bit of margin at the bottom. Then I've set the plan features And this one, you might remember from previous lessons, you might not, you might have to Google for this, but essentially what it does is it gets rid of those bullet points. Because we've got a unordered list here, and list items by default have the bullet, if we set that list style to none, it gets rid of it, which is really nice. Then I've set the padding and margin to get rid of the default padding and margin, to get them all closer to each other. And finally, I've added a small margin bottom at the bottom of this section so that it pushes the button down a little bit. And then I added some styling to the button, which turns it orange, makes the text white, makes the border 5 pixels to have the curved edges. And then I got rid of the border, which is this sort of black or gray default thing, which I don't really like the look of, so I can set that border to simply none. Now, the final thing, which is quite interesting, and I don't know if this is something that you actually realized you could do, but this combines a lot of the things that we learned previously, which is the use of a media query. I said that when the width of the screen is under 1250 pixels, I'm going to target the pricing container, which remember is our Flexbox container. And instead of having the flex direction be a row by default, I'm going to change it to have a flex direction of column. And what that does is when this gets under 1250 pixels, then it goes into a vertical flexbox, which is really nice. It makes more use of the space. And I've set that height to 100% because remember previously we had the height set to 100 viewport height, which means the height of our container is going to try and be as high as our viewport, which is only the space that we have here. Now, because we have more content than viewport height, it's actually better to set it to 100% so that it's not limited. And I'll show you what happens if I don't have this. You'll see that it's actually not quite right. When you scroll to the top and the bottom, it actually cuts off a bunch of stuff. That's the one final sort of modification that I've got. I hope you managed to get somewhere close to this, and if not, don't worry. Be sure to review some of the previous content like the lesson on media queries or the lesson on Flexbox sizing, and just make sure that you understand at least all of the code in the solution code and you understand what's going on. It doesn't matter if you didn't manage to style it exactly the same. You know, a lot of this stuff is kind of personal preference, and maybe you've made something that's even better than what I've got here. If you have, be sure to share a screenshot in the Q&A section. I would love to see what you guys have created. That's all from me for this section, and I'll see you in the next section. Hey, well done for completing yet another module. You're really putting a lot of these belts on, you know, like at the very beginning you were like a white belt when you first completed your first module, when you built the first things, when you built your first app, and now you're kind of getting on like towards the blue purplish sort of belts now. So I wanted to talk about another sort of thing that helps with habit building. And it's this idea of creating a cue for your habit. So if your habit is, say, I don't know, that you wanted to create. So if the habit that you wanted to create was, say, I don't know, do 50 press-ups every day, or go to the gym every day, or in our case, learning to code every day, then it really helps when you have a cue that you tag your habit onto. So what I mean by that, let's say that you already have a habit, right? You probably have loads of them. For me, it could be something like brushing my teeth in the mornings. So when I've tagged on this new habit I'm trying to form, like at the end of my existing habit, it makes it that much easier to do that thing that I want to do. So for example, I had a habit that I was trying to form, which is to meditate for 20 minutes every morning. And I never really managed to get around to doing it. There was always something in the way until I started saying, you know what? Every single time, every morning after I brush my teeth, I am just going to go and sit down and meditate for 20 minutes. Nothing else. And once I started doing that, it was like as if brushing my teeth was now this trigger or this cue for this other habit. And because already I brush my teeth every day, I hope you do too, then that habit kind of like just allows the next habit to build a little bit easier. So try this out. See if you already have a habit, and then try to do just half an hour of coding or an hour of coding afterwards, and see if that helps you get into the groove a little bit easier. And let me know your results. But most importantly, you've heard me say it, you're gonna hear me say it again. Keep going, keep going. I'm here for you, cheering you on. And I think you're great. I think you're doing fantastic. So keep going.